Now, Pete Seat, former spokesman for George W. Bush in the White House and vice president of Bo's Public Affairs Group, and Keith Boykin, a Democratic strategist and former aide in the Clinton White House. You both look way too young to have worked in either of those White Houses. Gentlemen, let me play you some sound. One of the things that has happened since the guilty verdict against Donald Trump has started talking about it and the possible implications in the country. Listen to what he said.
It could. What that could. I'm okay with it. I don't know that the public would stand it. I'm not sure the public would stand for it. With a.
You're saying if they tried house arrest or.
I think it would be tough for the public to take. At a certain point, there's a breaking point.
So, Keith, what do you hear in
that? I hear a desperate man who's extremely eager to try to prove that he's not concerned about this, but he really is. He's melting down, and the polls don't show that there's a breaking point of Americans. Americans are pretty much assuming that he is guilty, and Americans are believing, according to the polls, that the jury did the right thing. So I think Donald Trump is clearly unstable. But what's really most disturbing, I think, John, is that the Republican Party has shamefully aligned itself with him. This was supposed to be the law and order party. And now they're comparing Donald Trump to Mother Teresa and Nelson Mandela and Jesus Christ even, because supposedly Donald Trump is a victim and a martyr. But, they never have the same concern for black and brown people when we're wrongly incarcerated, or with the Central Park Five, who Donald Trump has still never apologized to. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy for Republicans to sort of align themselves with Donald Trump. And it indicates once again that they're no longer a governing party, but they have instead become a grievance party all about Donald Trump.
Pete, in his statement where you hear Donald Trump saying they could reach a breaking point, his supporters, there are some people who see that and see there is the hint of the threat of violence.
Well, those some people are hearing what they want to hear. I think it is crystal clear what former President Donald Trump meant in those comments, and that is for a lot of Americans, even those who dislike Donald Trump and thought he was guilty, the incarceration or home detention of a former president is a bridge too far. That's what he is speaking to, and if it comes to that on July 11th, his belief is that those people will come out and potentially support him in November or get off the sidelines to support him in November. So when we try to attach absent meaning to his words and phrases, look, he has said some outlandish things over the years. I will not deny that. This is not one of those times.
I do want to note that we don't know what the sentence will be, whether it's jail or house arrest or probation. I mean, it could very well be that there's no jail time at all, and it's extremely unlikely that he serves any sentence before the election anyway, because the appeals process will need to work itself out. Can I play some sound that deals with another investigation, actually ex-investigation in this case, because it happened on CNN, and I'm not sure it caught a lot of attention, but it gets to some of the tensions within the Republican Party. Armando Raju was talking to former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. And Matt Gaetz, the congressman from Florida, the issue around Matt Gaetz came up. And there had been a federal investigation into Gaetz, into whether there was some kind of trafficking with underage women. That investigation, as far as we know, was dropped, and Gaetz denies it. Yet McCarthy, the former speaker, still seems really upset with Matt Gaetz over the fact that Matt Gaetz helped get him bumped from the speaker's chair. So listen to this exchange between Manu and the former speaker.
If you think about it, if there's anybody who should go to trial, I mean, Gaetz is one who should be convicted in a trial.
Why? Why do you say that?
Well, we all know the challenge here. You can't sleep with underage women and think you can get away with it. I mean,
he denies that.
Well, the women don't.
Pete, that's a haymaker right there, and I think shows you that there's still a lot of bad blood. I should say that obviously Matt Gaetz does deny this, but so much bad blood still within House Republicans.
Bad blood is the understatement of the morning, John. Kevin McCarthy cannot stand Matt Gaetz, and we see that in all of his post-speaker activities. He is really targeting in primaries the individuals who ousted him, led the effort to oust him as Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Matt Gaetz obviously is at the top of that list. So I'm not surprised to hear the former speaker say these words, and I could see him starting a no Gaetz pack in the very near future and putting all of his time, energy, and effort into getting rid of Matt.
When you're talking about some of these primaries, Keith, it is worth noting that they're all pro-Trump candidates going after each other here in terms of who's being targeted by McCarthy and who's not.
Well, that's true. And I think even Kevin McCarthy is being hypocritical, because how many women have accused Donald Trump of sexual assault or sexual abuse? I think it's 24 women. And where is the outrage about that? But when it comes to Matt Gaetz, because he has a political vendetta against him, suddenly he wants to call him out on national television. And the Republican Party really has to decide. You know, we already know they're no longer the law and order party. Are they really the family values party, aligned with Donald Trump for paying hush money to a porn star to try to win an election? I think we have to really consider who the source is, and the Republicans have, I think, weakened their case to be an effective party that should be competitive in any election.
All right, Keith Boykin, Pete C., great to see both of you this morning. Two young men joining me for an important political discussion. Thank you very much. A new hour.